It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Stacey Pierson to the University of Florida and the Shorstein Center for Jewish Studies. Dr. Stacey Pierson is a scholar of rare and illustrious academic distinctions. Please let me outline minimally her academic trajectory. Going even slightly more in details would take more than the time we have for today's talk. So just briefly, and not doing justice to her stellar academic achievements. Dr. Pierson started her BA education at the Loyola Marymount Art University in Los Angeles. She is an Angelina by birth. Then continued in London at the SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies in London, in archaeology, followed by her study in modern Chinese at the Ealing College, and finishing her doctoral work at the University of Sussex in history of art. Professor Pierson is professor of the history of Chinese ceramics, an honorary title, or rather distinguished professorship title, she received in 22, and is the first chaired professor of Chinese ceramics in the United Kingdom. Her book, I will speak only of one book as a metonymy for 6 other volumes that she published, is on private collecting, exhibitions, and the shaping of art history in London. And it serves really as a metonymy of her entire oeuvre and opus, concentrated on collections, gathering artwork and donations. She is the president of the Oriental Ceramic Society of London in London and the series editor for the Routledge Histories of Material Culture and Collecting. What brings Stacey Pierson to us is her latest research on the Jewish background of one of the greatest collectors of the Chinese ceramics, Sir Percival David. A son of the founder of the Bank of India, he turned to collecting Chinese ceramics, resulting in the largest collection in the UK and probably in the world outside of the mainland China, reported by the Times of London to be worth 1 billion, that is with B, pounds. He donated this inherited wealth and collection to the UK, a country not always generous to its Jews. It was an on and off history of sorts. Of that collection, the Percival David Foundation of Chinese Art, Stacey Pierson was curator and head of department for some 10 years, and this collection is now in the British Museum. In the Shorstein Center for Jewish Studies, we are well aware of the great contribution of benefactors and donors, like Shorstein, to the workings of our center and the value and function of such donations, not only material. Stacey Pierson's expertise in the practices of Jewish collection and donation in the UK motivated to a great degree our inviting her to the Shorstein Center. So, without further ado, Professor Pierson will talk to us today about the Jews of Mumbai and Sir Percival David. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pierson.
Thank you very much, Dragan. I've been asked to wear this microphone. Can you hear me okay when I'm using this? Yeah? So really grateful for that very generous introduction, and I'm very honored to be speaking here at the Shorstein Center about the person whose life and artworks really shaped my professional identity as a curator and as a scholar. So as Dragan mentioned, a year ago, the Percival David collection hit the headlines in England. And that's because the collection had been donated to the nation in the British Museum. And as you can see from the headlines, it was valued at, as Dragan reminded us, £1 billion. Having been the person responsible for the insurance quotes on this collection, I would say that's highly generous. But it's still extremely valuable. I mean, I would put it at half that, but that's still quite impressive. So there was a lot of press about the collection, about the value of the gift. And now I have to say, so I teach in the gallery that it's in, and now when I bring students in, we get a lot of Chinese visitors giving tours, and the first thing they say is how much the collection is worth. And I'm like, really? Okay. So this collection, as Dragan mentioned, is considered one of the finest in the world. And apart from maybe the former imperial collection, there are no other collections like this of this quality. And you might think, well, it's just pots, right? But these pots, many of them are actually in the imperial collection in China. So Percival David seemingly dedicated his life to forming these collections. And he initially donated the gift of the collection to the University of London, which is where I came across it. So in 1950, it went to the University of London, and in a museum that was named after him called the Percival David Foundation of Chinese Art. Confusingly, it's often shortened to PDF. So that causes a lot of problems. But so this was a university department as well as a museum that was open to the public. So that's me, teaching about 10 years ago, I would say. Yeah, different hair color, different haircut, with the collection. And then on the right, you can see Percival David and his wife, Sheila. So she was his widow. And we were very fortunate in the museum because Sheila was a great sort of supporter of the museum and the collection after he died. So he died in 1964. And she was a lot younger, outlived him by almost 30 years. And she was also very helpful because Percival David did not leave any personal archive. He didn't write a memoir. There are no journals. There's nothing, basically. So, you know, as the curators of his museum, our responsibility was to the collection, but also to the collector, and we had to interpret the collector and the collection for the public. But we had no archival material to draw upon. So fortunately, my predecessor as curator developed a friendship with his widow, Lady David, and asked her to share her recollections of their life together, what she knew about his history and the history of the collection. And so she wrote 2 articles that are really the cornerstone, or used to be the cornerstone of what we knew about him and his life. And of course, she was a great champion of his. So she said in one of her articles that, you know, the collection is unparalleled, which is true. It was assembled under ideal conditions by a connoisseur. I mean, it's obviously very celebratory, but she also said he was born a collector, which is what every collector likes to say. And he had an intense interest and profound knowledge of Chinese ceramics, which is true. And he also wanted it to be an instrument for teaching for serious-minded students, and at the same time be available for public viewing. And so that's what he achieved by giving it to the University of London. But she also then gave some highlights about his life story. And so for many years, this is what we knew about him. That he was born in India in 1892. He succeeded to the title. That means he inherited his father's aristocratic title of baronet. So he became the second Sir Percival David in 1926. She said he graduated from Cambridge with a law degree and decided to make Chinese art his sphere of endeavor. Just to let you know, she was very British, and so that's what the language reveals. So she said he already knew Chinese language, which was unusual when he went to China. And he also helped finance the rebuilding of many of the parts of the old Chinese palace that were turned into the Palace Museum, which still exists today. So great supporter of China and its museum. He also bought a lot of pieces from the imperial collection. He met her in 1931, and I don't think this is a euphemism, but she said, showed her his fabulous collection. Right? They, were then constant companions thereafter. He also established a chair of Chinese art and archaeology at University of London, and in 1935, he organized and was director of what is truly one of the most important exhibitions of Chinese art in history in 1935. So this was a lot of the facts that we knew about him were the things that she told us, and these are events that are documented elsewhere. So with that in mind, if we asked the question, who was Percival David? Based on what she told us, we know some things about him, that he was a renowned connoisseur and collector. He was born in Bombay in 1892. He had a title and he studied law. But apparently he threw that away and decided to dedicate his life to Chinese art. So this is the story we all believed until I decided while I was working as curator that I would also go on and do a PhD. And as part of my dissertation, I wrote a chapter on Percival David's life, thinking it would be a really straightforward thing. And to some extent, it was straightforward because it turned out there was a lot of information about him out there, but it was not what we were told. So if you ask the question again, based on what we know now, and you look at, get used to this, what I now know, the story is slightly different. So yes, he was born in Bombay in 1892, but he was also born into a Baghdadi Jewish family, one of the most prominent Baghdadi Jewish families, because his great-grandfather was David Sassoon. So I assume most people in the audience know who he is, but I'll explain more in a moment. So that's an image I took of one of the many buildings in what was then Bombay, it's currently Mumbai, that are named after David Sassoon, okay? So he came from an illustrious family in Bombay, and of course, he was Jewish, and that was never mentioned. So what is the story of the Baghdadi Jews in Bombay? I mean, in a nutshell, they were one of a number of Jewish families that are originally from Baghdad and other areas of what used to be called Mesopotamia, who settled in India in the late 18th and 19th centuries. And the families were following in the footsteps of David Sassoon, who was the sort of pioneer in this. And he left a world which was under Ottoman control, and he was seeking religious as well as financial freedom. And he went to India, and he established what became a worldwide merchant empire. And he had business interests that included many things, but crucially the opium trade. So the opium trade was really what created the fortunes of many of these Baghdadi Jews in India. So he, like many others of his generation and background, had multiple wives, but he had most of his children with 2 wives. And this is David Sassoon on the right, and those are 2 of his sons. The son on the left is Elias David. Now Elias, he went by ED. And I'll just warn you now, the Sassoons use the same names all the time, okay? So I'll do my best, but you'll find that everybody's got the same name, basically. So ED, ED had a daughter named Hannah. And he also, after a spat with that brother, after their father died, set up his own branch of the Sassoon Company. And one of his employees was confusingly named Sassoon David. So what happens? Hannah Sassoon meets Sassoon Jacob David. And I found this picture of Sassoon David from 1924. Let's see if I can pinpoint him, like right there. Whoa, it's not working. So in the middle, there's an older gentleman with a white beard. So that's him at a wedding in Bombay in 1924. And he was at one time described as the wealthiest Jew in Bombay. He became phenomenally successful, on a par with the Sassoons. And he set up his own company after he married Hannah Sassoon in 1876. And they got married in Bombay at Magen David Synagogue, which you can see there at the top. And that was built by Hannah's grandfather, David Sassoon, sorry. And it is known today as the Blue Synagogue, but it's one of two I discovered that are known as the Blue Synagogue. The other one was built later by one of her brothers. Now that is an old picture. When I visited it in March of this year, I discovered it was in a terrible state. I mean, it's really crumbling. I went in to view the inside and it was quite scary because there was masonry falling from the upper level. But at the time, this was a beautiful synagogue, and they got married there. They had their wedding party at her grandfather's house. That's an illustration of it from the 19th century. It was known as Sanssouci. It was huge, absolutely huge. It's a hospital building now. And this wedding was reported in the newspapers, and there were descriptions of all the guests, obviously the bride and the groom. And so after this, Sassoon David sets up his own business called Sassoon David, or S.J. David & Co. And he becomes very successful, but also quite a prominent politician in Bombay. He becomes the equivalent of mayor. So I guess now we have a second Indian mayor, right? So in New York. So he became mayor of Bombay. They called it sheriff. And he also donated quite a lot of money to charitable causes, including many Jewish causes. He also tried to, along with the other Baghdadi Jews in India, align themselves with the British, because of course it's British India at this stage. And they didn't want to be identified as local, because local Indians were subject to a lot of restrictive laws. So he then is knighted for his efforts. In 1905, he becomes Sir Sassoon David, and he's given then a hereditary title, the baronetcy that his son inherited, and he's awarded the Star of India for services to the crown. So that's just to give a sense of how prominent he was. And they had a son in 1892 named, confusingly, which is why I couldn't find his birth certificate for many years, David Percival Victor Ezekiel David. So I was like, David. So his wedding certificate actually said David on it. And that was the only photograph I could find of him as a relatively young man. He's surprisingly not very well photographed. And sadly, he was their only surviving son. So they had 5 children. 2 other sons died in infancy. Another sister died in what they called a carriage accident. So that was a horse and carriage accident. And then he survived, and then his other sister survived. So there was a lot of pressure on him as the only surviving son. And some of you may be familiar with the Sassoon story. So for myself, I put this together, but it might be helpful to see who David is related to and how he's related to them as a Sassoon, because he's also first cousins with Victor Sassoon, who's one of the more famous members of the Sassoon family. If you don't know his story, look it up. He was quite interesting. So that's his first cousin, so his mother's nephew. He's also related to a Sassoon who's very prominent in Britain, Sir Philip Sassoon, who I will tell you a bit more about later. So if you look at the Sassoon line, he's a direct descendant of David Sassoon, and this was something that was never mentioned in the history that we were made aware of and that Lady David shared with us. So what was his life like? Obviously, he lived a very privileged life in Bombay. He was tutored at home in English, and then was sent to Elphinstone College, which was effectively It's not now, it's a very good school, but at the time it was founded, it was like a finishing school for the sons of the wealthy merchants who were Indian as well as Baghdadi Jewish and other. He's then sent to London in 1911 and married to his first cousin, Vir Moselle David. So make of that what you will, but they didn't grow up together. They didn't really know each other because she was his uncle's daughter, and his uncle ran the family business in Hong Kong. So they were married. They had a wedding at this synagogue, which is one of the two West London synagogues, Lauderdale Road, if you want to look it up. And they had 2 daughters, but one died in infancy. So Percival David marries, he becomes a father, and he starts collecting art. Turns out the first thing he ever collected was Chinese stamps. And then very quickly, at the start of the First World War that happened, he started buying Chinese ceramics. And he said much later in life, in something I found in a random place, that he was inspired because he went to visit a cousin who lived in the south coast of England and saw that he had Chinese porcelain on display in his living room. And he said it was just like a, what did I call it in French, a coup de foudre. You know, he just fell in love and decided to make collecting his life's work, which is not entirely true. But he started out collecting at a very high level as well. One of the earliest pieces he bought is this one, which is still in the collection today. And in Chinese ceramics terms, this is a really fine piece. I mean, the kind of piece a real connoisseur would buy. And he's only just started collecting. So how is he managing this? It turns out he's being very strategic about it. He's introduced to it by a cousin. He then starts to find out more about that world, the museum, the collectors, the curators. He has his cousin, Marcus Ezekiel, who had worked for the Shorstein Company in India, introduce him to the Victoria and Albert Museum. And there are records there that describe him as a young collector who shows great enthusiasm for and a very sound understanding of Chinese porcelain as early as 1916. And he therefore starts donating objects to the museums, again, to kind of cultivate a relationship with them. He gave that piece to the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1917, and it's still on display there today. But I would argue that he was also collecting gardens, because in 1919, partly to establish himself as a wealthy gentleman, he bought a country estate in England in a town called Henley, which is about an hour from London. And he bought this estate, which is, it's so bizarre, I don't even really know how to start to explain it. So it's called Friar Park, consists of this huge house and about 60 acres of themed gardens. And it was built by, well, they always are, an eccentric gentleman in Victorian England, who was, saw himself as a medievalist. He was really interested in medieval history and Renaissance history and stuff like that. So he decides to build his fantasy house. And the house has a single decorative theme, which is friars. So he, basically every single built-in element of the house relates to friars. And there are early kind of visitor accounts of seeing what the house looks like, which say that they're impressed with the technology because it has early electric light installed, but the switches are all friars' body parts. I mean, I didn't want to think about what they could all be, but let's assume it's just noses, okay? So every aspect of the interior relates to friars. There are sculptures of friars on the newel posts of the staircase, obviously the light switches. And then outside, you have these themed gardens. And so you have the medieval garden, the Renaissance garden, Japanese garden, Tudor garden. The one on the left is one of the Renaissance gardens. The one in the middle is the Alpine garden. And you can see that white-capped mountain in the background. That's a miniature replica of the Matterhorn. And then there's also, I couldn't find a photograph of it, but there are also caves that have the equivalent of sort of like Disneyland rides in them. One cave that was described by a visitor had electric lights that were in the shape of glass fruits that would light up as you traveled through the cave. And it was populated with garden gnomes. Do you know what those are? I don't know what they would be called here. Yeah, I mean, garden gnomes. Anyway, so it is definitely what the English call a folly. It was a real spectacle, and this is where Percival David lived. So that says something about his taste. I mean, he's obviously, he really likes being surrounded by extravagant decor. And you're probably wondering why there's a picture of that hippie on the bottom. Does anyone recognize who that hippie is? Yes. So that hippie is George Harrison, the Beatle. And he's sitting on a sort of wooden deck in one of the lakes, and you can see the house, Friar Park in the background. So George Harrison bought the house in the 1970s, long after Percival and his first wife died. Lived there. It was in a state of disrepair, he said, but he set about restoring the gardens and everything. And I think he was living with his first wife. Was it Patty Boyd or somebody like that? So he, interestingly, wrote a song about the house. So if you want to see some film of the house, go on YouTube, and there's a video for the song Cracker Box Palace. And it's him and his friends, like in full like hippie regalia, tripping throughout the house while this song is going on. And for those who are interested in film, it was directed by Eric Idle. So there is a connection here, but he's the reason why you can't visit Friar Park anymore. It used to be open to the public, but he was the victim of a really vicious knife attack at home. He survived, but after that they were never the same. So the house has been closed to visitors ever since, because his widow still lives there. So this is Percival David's world at that time. He then, mainly because he's being trained up to take over the family business, he goes to China in 1924 for the first time. He's visiting the family offices, as well as cousin Victor's buildings like Sassoon House. Anyone who knows Shanghai, this is the Peace Hotel. So that was originally Sassoon House, and then it had a hotel on the upper floors. And he also is buying Chinese art while he's there, including these imperial jades that are now in another museum. And in 1926, suddenly, his father dies, and he becomes Sir Percival David. So he's the next baronet. He inherits the title, he inherits the family businesses, he also inherits the family trust. And in his father's will, his father made it clear that he expected his son and also his daughter and their descendants to carry on the respecting and observing the Jewish faith, because he said any of them who didn't would be disinherited from the will. So the family trust had a history of supporting Jewish causes, mainly in Bombay, but then they started supporting them in London, including the building of another synagogue in West London, which is popularly known as the Holland Park Synagogue, but you can also see it was named after his father, Sassoon David. And in his father's name, he also continued to support that synagogue. In 1930, he donated a Sefer Torah, and this was reported in the Jewish Chronicle. And it said a large gathering was present on Sunday afternoon at, it's also known as the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, Sassoon David Synagogue, when a Sefer Torah presented by Percival David was consecrated. So he presented it to the synagogue in his father's name. And the rabbi there, David Mesquita, described in the sermon for the donation that his father was someone whose soul was deeply and essentially Jewish. His ideals were the lofty Jewish ideals. So at this time, Percival David is still actively observant and making a real effort to continue to support the Jewish causes that were so important to his family. And that included Hebrew University. We know that he visited, or I found out that he visited Jerusalem in 1931, and I found an account of that visit written by somebody else who had introduced him to Chaim Alosarov, who was the famous labor Zionist who was assassinated quite young. And she also described the conversation that they had, and apparently Percival David said to him, look, I'm not a Zionist, but I'm happy to support the cause of Jewish-Arab relations. And he did that by funding housing and agricultural projects that Alosaroff felt would, give people a better attitude, a more positive attitude about Zionism. So he also, in his father's name, founded a professorship, a chair at Hebrew University in Near Eastern art and archaeology. That chair still exists, but it has a different name now. And it was in his father's name, so it was the Sassoon David Chair. And I'm not sure why, but at the time, its focus was the art and archaeology of the Near East with special reference to what they called the Muslim period. And in the newspaper reports about this, it talks about Percival David also being very interested in sponsoring archaeological projects in the Middle East and in Asia, including the excavations at Ur, which is, your archaeological history. Those were discovered by Leonard Woolley. So Percival David was actually actively funding those expeditions. And another quite famous one in Korea. Any of you who know Korean archaeology, there are these famous tombs that had the gold crowns in them. And one of them, the excavation was sponsored by Percival David. So he didn't limit his educational philanthropy to Hebrew University. He also founded the chair at University of London, at my college that used to be called the School of Oriental Studies in that old building. And the first later professor but lecturer was Percival Yates, who had been physician to the British legation in what they called Peking in the late 19th century. They usually didn't have a lot to do, so he just kind of made himself into a ancient Chinese bronze specialist. So when he came back, he was appointed the first lecturer in Chinese art and archaeology, which became a degree that we still teach today. So, effectively, I teach on that degree course. And so we owe that to Percival David. And at the same time, so he's running the family business, he's doing all this philanthropy, supporting all these educational projects and archaeology, but he's also publishing his own scholarship. So Percival David became quite a renowned scholar of Chinese ceramics, but also the historiography of Chinese ceramics in China, because he also collected rare Chinese books. And he collected rare Chinese books that had the subjects related to Chinese art. There's a really long history of what we would think of as art history in China, going back to about 1000 BC. So Percival David was collecting these texts and using them for research. And he wrote one article that I still assign to my student today. The one I wrote there, the title is Commentary on Jewware, Wuware, which is that piece, which he published in 1937. And so his scholarship, some of it is a little bit old-fashioned, and maybe out of date, but some of it is actually still really solid scholarship on aspects of Chinese art and Chinese rare books and Chinese stamps. So the 1930s was really, the most active period for him in a lot of ways, with these archaeological projects, with the sponsoring of education and the synagogue. But also it was a turning point in his life because he decided he needed a London pad. And so the Dorchester Hotel, still there today, opened in 1931. And Percival David took 7 rooms in Dorchester because he could afford it, had them designed to his taste, and he installed his collection there. Crucially, he got a manicure while he was there one day from this young lady, Sheila. So Sheila was working at the hotel. Unfortunately, she was only 17, the same age as his daughter. But imagine this is someone who had no choice in life in his partner. He was married off to his first cousin. They probably got along, but I don't know if it went further than that. But he meets someone who he truly falls in love with. So yes, it's problematic, but you can kind of understand, why this was such a dramatic thing for him. And so that's when he showed her his collection, and they became companions ever since. What that meant is that this is where his life split in two, and he ended up running two lives in parallel. So he has his life with his wife, his children, the house, Friar Park, and his chairmanship of the family company. He then has this London life, which is all focused on his Chinese art collecting activities. He has his London pad and his London partner, if you will. So he then continues to really participate in a lot of activities as a collector as well, lending his objects to exhibitions and organizing exhibitions, including lending objects to his cousin Philip's exhibition. So the Dorchester Hotel is on Park Lane, and just up the road at number 25 lived Philip. So Philip was half Sassoon, half Rothschild. So he was born in France. His parents built this house, which is now destroyed, but and decorated it in kind of 18th century French style. Philip, after his parents died, lived there with his sister and then his cousin. He never married. He was also a collector, but very prominent in British politics. So he was a member of parliament. He was also, during the First World War, that's a picture from then, he was secretary to Field Marshal Haig and decorated for his work. He was a passionate pilot and airman, and while he was member of parliament, he became the air secretary, as they called it. And so he was very prominent in politics, fabulously wealthy, but also a great collector himself. And his charitable work consisted of organizing exhibitions for raising money for the maternity hospital that he was the chairman of, which was the Royal London Hospital today. And so one exhibition he organized was Porcelain Through the Ages, and he called upon all his friends and relatives who, anybody who was anybody to lend, including cousin Percival David. And this was mentioned in the newspaper reports. So at the time, he was quite openly, associating with his Sassoon family history. And it's only later that this becomes erased, because Percival David actually becomes really prominent right after this. And he's visiting other exhibitions, and in London in the 1930s, the Royal Academy starts organizing what they called international exhibitions, which are really, well, I'm going to argue it in my next book, the beginnings of blockbuster exhibitions. So the first one he saw was Persian art, 1931, and he said that in their archives, I found a letter, he said he thought it was amazing to see all this art from that region on display in London and all the people viewing it. So why don't we do that for China? And that's why he organized the International Exhibition of Chinese Art. It was all his idea. He was the director of the exhibition, and this turned out to be the most important exhibition of Chinese art in history. One of the most popular as well. Over 450,000 people visited it. It was an absolute sensation. It also included loans from China for the very first time ever. And the loans from China, you can see him unpacking some of them with one of the Chinese delegates. They were sent over on a Navy warship. So this was also a diplomatic triumph for Britain. And it's through this exhibition that he also, of course, loaned his objects to, that he became famous, like beyond his immediate circle. And there is also, I hope it'll work, a film.
Various government departments have done splendid work in the cause of art by their active part in the arrangements for the exhibition of Chinese art at the Royal Academy, held under the auspices of the British and Chinese governments. Most of these superb treasures come from the Chinese imperial collections, formerly housed in the Forbidden City at Peking. These beautiful works of art, some of them as much as 3,000 years old, make this exhibition one of the most beautiful and remarkable ever held in London.
So that's the only moving image we have of Percival David, and it's quite interesting because he he's standing upright, and that's important because in a few years that will all change. And so just wanted to mention this, which is something I recently discovered, because he started to get interested. He was kind of one of these people that needs a project. So once that exhibition's done, he becomes obsessed with Marco Polo. And so he wants to pay a lot of scholars to transcribe and translate into English and then publish in a 4-volume catalog. One of the surviving manuscripts from the 14th century of Marco Polo's travels of the world, which he found in Spain. So he needed some help with that. So he contacted a library that had recently moved to London, and it's called the Warburg Institute. Very famous institute for, and really the home of, the study of Renaissance art history. And it was founded by Abby Warburg, or Warburg, of the banking family in Hamburg. It was forced to close when the Nazis came to power in 1933, and some collectors in London pooled their money together and brought the library to London. It was still in a precarious state, but everyone who worked there, of course, got fired or had left. And it was affiliated with a lot of universities in Germany where there were a lot of Jewish scholars who, of course, also had to leave their jobs. So he enlisted the help of the director of the Warburg Institute in his Marco Polo project, and he was happy to do it because he needed money. And so he said, we'll provide some expertise and project management for this. And in return, David helped fund their running costs in London. But crucially, he also anonymously to them supported a number of the refugee scholars so that they could have positions in England at the Warburg Institute. So he was very important in that project. And it's through the Warburg Institute that I found out that kind of a sad story. He started to have health problems after about 1935. And in his correspondence with Saxel, the director of the Warburg Institute, he talks about having, symptoms, like he calls it liver trouble and circulatory trouble and all this stuff. So Fritz Saxel says, oh, actually, there's a doctor here I can refer you to. Because of course, Freud had, in the last years of his life, had fled Vienna and come to London. So he said, well, I'd really like to refer you to Dr. Freud. And Percival's like, well, that's really nice, but I'm aware of him, of course, and I know he's actually a collector of Chinese art, which he was, but I don't think I'm not sure it's in my head, but thank you very much. So sadly, this proved to be the first symptoms of ALS, and it was ALS that he actually died from many years later. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a motor neuron disease, degenerative, and that actor Eric Dane has ALS. So what happens is your mind is fine, but your body eventually gives way. So Percival David, in the last sort of 20 years of his life, continues to support as many causes as he can, including during the Second World War, because in the beginning of the Second World War, children living in London were evacuated to the countryside. The really fortunate ones were evacuated to Friar Park on the invitation of Percival and his wife. And the children who stayed there, a number of them shared their recollections, and they said it was the most magical thing because Percival David's wife was so motherly and so welcoming to them, it made it so much easier for them to be away from their families. So she's been written out of this story, but through little snippets like this, we can kind of bring her back. He also stored, fortunately, the library catalog of the Warburg Institute at Friar Park because their London building was bombed. It suffered a direct hit in 1940, and so they would have lost all of that. And of course, he moved his own collection back to Friar Park. And then weirdly, he decides to support the war effort. So he starts going around the world, leaves England with Sheila, the person he met at the Dorchester. They end up they go to Canada, then the US, and making their way to Asia because David wants to get over there to close down some of his business offices. Sadly, they decided to go to Shanghai, and they arrived there late in the evening on December 6th, 1941, and we all probably know what happened on December 8th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese had invaded China in 1937, so they get even more angry, and they start bombing the ships in Shanghai Harbor, and they place all foreigners under house arrest, including Percival David and Sheila. Now, Sheila's only 26. She's never left the country, and she's traveling around the world during war with him. So I think she was incredibly brave. But essentially, they were under house arrest, so they were allowed to get out. She said they were able to visit other collectors with a Japanese kind of guard. And so he ended up collecting while he was there during the war. And they were lucky because thanks to the intervention of the man who became the King of Sweden, who was a friend, they were evacuated with other diplomats in 1942, sent to Mozambique in exchange for Japanese prisoners. And that was useful for him because his health really deteriorated, and it was felt that he needed warm weather. And apparently in Cape Town, which, it's a British dominion, okay, so it's actually technically still part of the British Empire. It was a safe place for them to be. And he sought medical treatment, and a doctor there said, no, you really need to go to this clinic in America called the Mayo Clinic. So they left South Africa, and meanwhile he thinks he's dying as well. I mean, he's really, really sick. So he's thinking about his legacy, his future. They go to the Mayo Clinic, and the Mayo Clinic is the clinic that identified ALS as a disease, which is generally called Lou Gehrig's disease here because Lou Gehrig, the baseball player, was the first diagnosed patient. So in all this, he's not getting any better, so he decides at that stage he's going to give his collection to the University of London, and that's where it started. And after he did that, the museum was then set up, and sadly, his wife found out about Sheila, and so sued him for divorce. He didn't contest it, but they had to sell Friar Park. He also gave up a lot of his interest in the family trust, because it's her family trust too, of course, and also gave up a lot of his interest for his daughter, which was good. But he had nowhere to live, so he insisted that the university find him an apartment in the museum building, which it did. But he's wheelchair bound. He's given his collection away. He doesn't have as much money, but it turned out while he was in South Africa, he moved all his money to Bermuda. So he still had enough to live on. So all the money that he earned in India went to Bermuda, so that was good. So after all that, really this is when he starts crafting a new history that erases everything that is to do with India, the Sassoons, his Jewish background, because of course Sheila is not Jewish. So his second wife was not Jewish, and according to his father's will, she would have been cut out. So the museum becomes a great success. It becomes the sort of home of the study of Chinese art, a really active department of the University of London, and he insisted that his wife be the curator. But eventually, it got to be too much because she was also his caretaker. With ALS, you lose the use of a lot of your limbs progressively, so he, in this incredible picture that I just found, you can see that he's in a wheelchair. So they continued to travel, though. He was still interested in Chinese art. He's still buying stamps. They end up in Taiwan, which at that time was Republican China's new home. It was called Free China, and the president was General Chiang Kai-shek, who appears in this picture with Percival David and Sheila. I was really surprised when I found out. So they had met when he organized the 1935 exhibition, because Chiang Kai-shek was also the Republican leader at the time he was organizing the loan. So after that trip, that was it. His health rapidly deteriorated, but he needed money to cover his medical costs. So they started selling his very famous stamp collection. And his name in the stamp world, philately world, is as well known as it is in the Chinese art world. So I meet people who say, oh, I have a David China. And for years, I didn't know what that meant until I realized, oh, it's stamps. So they actually were able to make enough money to cover a lot of his medical bills, but then sadly he died October 10, 1964. And this was reported in the newspapers. World famous connoisseur of Chinese art and ceramics has died at age 72. There were lots of obituaries. Those that were written by fellow collectors always said the same thing, that he was the greatest connoisseur and collector of Chinese art of our time. And it's really, this has been a quick overview of what I've managed to understand about his life history. And it's because of what I have discovered about, the necessity of restoring his Jewish identity, and also realizing that he was running that life in parallel with another one that really kind of led to the title of the book project I've just written on this. So, Merchant of India, Collector of China, The Parallel Lives of Percival David, which I hope will enrich our understanding of him and his various work, not just his Chinese artwork, but everything else he did, in his other equally impactful life. So I will close it there. Thank you very much.
So there are questions, so I will step away. So Jack Kugelmas has a question. Go ahead.
So thank you, and of course it's fascinating. But the thing that strikes me, of course, is the Jewish connection to Orientalism. It's just fascinating. It's not the only case. So, and I'm sure you know the other cases very well, but
Yeah.
I'll pause at that.
Yeah, there's definitely, if you're talking about Orientalism in terms of philology, of course, there's a very strong Jewish connection there, but also in terms of collecting. David didn't collect Judaica, but many of his cousins did. I don't know if any of you saw or even saw the catalog for, there was a Sassoon exhibition, an exhibition about the Sassoons in New York City about, it was just before the pandemic, I think. And it actually covers a lot of the collection. And it really sort of brought home the fact that what a strong connection there is, at least in the collecting world, in the material culture world, in the textual, bibliographic world between the Jews and Orientalism. So yes, that's very true. I'd like to restore his Jewish identity, but he wasn't. There's kind of a debate now about whether he should be described as a Jewish collector. And some people have said to me, well, he didn't collect Judaica, so he's not. I said, well, it really depends on how you're defining the identity of the collector and the collection itself. So yes, good point.
Hi. I believe you said something about his knowledge of Chinese before moving to London. And I believe you said that was also prior to his starting his collection in Chinese art. Do you have any idea of what inspired him to learn Chinese or what brought that about?
Wow, yeah. I knew somebody would ask this. So it's something I've been trying to find evidence for years. And I can see that he could read Chinese because the rare books were part of the collection that he gave to the university. So that went into our special collection library. And you can see his handwritten notes in pencil, I'm pleased to say, in a lot of these rare books, and he's debating about what the translation of the character would be. So he definitely can read Chinese. I don't know that he could speak it, but I saw those notes on a book he purchased in 1918. Obviously I can't specifically date the notes, but I'm fairly sure that it was his own initiative. He wasn't required to do it on behalf of the family business because they had local people. And it was related to his approach to scholarship, was to not just collect things, but collect knowledge and collect scholars as well. The best scholars who could contribute to whatever the project was. And I believe there's a scholar, a Chinese scholar, who was based at Cambridge. And I've seen his name pop up a couple of times, and I think Percival David was working with him. So my guess is he hired him. And this appears to have happened in 1922. That that's as far back as I can push it. So I wish I had something more definitive, but I'm absolutely certain he could read Chinese, so that's definitely true. Yeah. Which is obviously unusual. None of his peers as collectors could read Chinese, none of them.
I have a question.
Oh.
So could you talk a little bit more about the first, or the article that you assigned in your class, and a little bit more about his scholarship in advancing Chinese ceramics and art?
Yeah, so his scholarship followed a pattern that I think you'll now understand. And he believed in what we would call centering his knowledge in China, okay? That's what we would call it today. And he believed that the way to be a true connoisseur of Chinese art was to approach it as a Chinese connoisseur would. And so he actively studied and collected books related to Chinese, we would call it connoisseurship, but it was about, there's a name for it in Chinese, and it's more about studying the text, and the text being the authority for your knowledge about things, if that makes sense. And so he would use that approach in anything he researched. So that article that I assigned is actually a study of all the textual references in Chinese, and I'll point out it's classical Chinese, it's not modern Chinese, which is even harder, to that particular type of ware. And so that's why it still stands up today, because you don't need to do that research again. And he actively collected as many of those texts as he could as well. So it's kind of like the ultimate collector fantasy, right? Is to be able to collect the objects and then the knowledge about those objects. But he also had, the intellectual chops to back that up. So almost all of his published articles, whether they're about stamps, books, ceramics, painting, follow that kind of template.
When Sir Percival David married Sheila and he lost his financial interest in the trust, was that because that was a provision of the trust, that if you married outside of the faith, you lose your interest?
It was not a provision of the trust. It was agreed because he wanted to ensure that he didn't have to pay alimony. I mean, I didn't specifically say that in the book, but that's what I discovered. Because I should have mentioned, I got very lucky. After Sheila died, her personal lawyer approached me a few years later and just handed me a file. And he said, do with it what you want. Looked, and it was Percival David's estate file. So that was a gold mine. And that's where I found, the provisions in his father's will, why he had to give up his interest in the trust. And it was also a way of avoiding what they called death duties in England, or they called it at that time, because it was a transfer of capital to the family, right? Because he didn't obviously give them a collection. But yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me. Yeah.